that I have in store for you all. Oh, well, actually, first of all, I just want to say thanks so much for coming, for giving me your attention and time. And I just want to acknowledge what's happening in Ukraine and um, yeah, just pray that somehow miraculously things steer towards peace and diplomacy. So, hold on just a second. I'm going to share my screen. Can y'all see that?
Yes.
Cool. Thank you, Robert. So, as you can see, my presentation is titled Evolution and the Morphology of Consciousness. And so in this talk, as I mentioned, I'll be presenting the work of the 20th century philosopher Owen Barfield, his participatory approach to the study of the evolution of consciousness. And so if you're not familiar with this term participatory, which I assume most people are, but if you're not, at least in the context of Barfield's work, it suggests that his method for studying the evolution of consciousness doesn't separate consciousness from the cosmos, which I think many do tend to do. So in the very method, he's avoiding that, or to treat it as an epiphenomenon or like a secretion of matter. And so because my focus is exclusively on, well, for the most part, just on his method, I will only be referring to Barfield's more concrete narrative of the evolution of consciousness to the extent that it helps me to explicate his approach and also to distinguish, as I mentioned in the description, between a history of consciousness and a history of ideas. So I want to frame Barfield's approach, participatory approach, as one that reflects a deeper insight into the growth, into growth and becoming. So the participatory in the sense that thinking is a kind of process of growth and becoming, but also potentially of decay as well, and that this is a feature not just of what we have sort of narrowly describe as biological life forms, but in some sense of the cosmos itself. So metamorphosis, the phenomenon. In 1949, Barfield published an essay titled Goethe and Evolution. And in it, he's reflecting on the German poet and scientist Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's role in the emergence of evolution as a way of thinking about phenomena in the 18th century. So the emergence of evolution or development as a way of thinking, whereas before evolution was tied to this idea that like things that are born out of other things have like the little thing in miniature, whereas what the way Goethe was seeing it or approaching it was to well, let me back up just a little bit. So rather than describe evolution as a theory, Barfield refers to it as Goethe dealt with it, which is to look upon it as a fact, as a phenomenon or an image that is, in a sense, pre-theorized. So as Barfield described, quote, the mental image so familiar to us now, today, and yet itself so strange, of one form gradually changing into another form, and yet somehow retaining its identity. So this aspect of one form transforming into another and maintaining its identity is important. So remember that. So Goethe and Barfield as well approaching development or evolution as a mental image is, again, it's like pre-theorized. So try to bracket, because this is before Darwin's theory of natural selection really took on fire and became so, I guess, commonplace in our thinking. Try to bracket any kind of associations with the word evolution and development, and just think about it as I described it before, one form transforming into another and retaining its identity. Goethe, so in this essay, Barfield says, Goethe called this metamorphosis. So in this slide, I'm presenting that as I go forward, I'll be using interchangeably metamorphosis and evolution. So just to think evolution in this kind of very bald, basic way as metamorphosis. And so Goethe did not go beyond what he was observing and impute a particular theory, which, like natural selection, which is not, I'll get to that later. But instead of calling it evolution, Goethe referred to this activity as metamorphosis, and especially observed it at work in plants and the plant development, plant morphology, as well as comparative osteology, so looking at different animal bones, different skeletons of animals, and in chromatics, or the dynamics of light and darkness and color that emerges between them. So through his devoted observation, Goethe came to recognize something that was not fully given by the appearance of a plant in particular at any given moment in its life cycle. So that there must be some kind of invisible reality which encompassed all the phases of the plant's development, that aspect that somehow maintains the identity as the plant transforms. So he referred to these invisible realities as phenomenon, or in particular with the plant, the Pflanze, the archetypal plant, but in general, the phenomenon, or the archetypal phenomenon. So it's this lawfulness that shows up in the dynamics of color, in the unfolding of plants, in the morphology of bone structure. I can find it everywhere. And so these, we should think about these as formative ideas. They're invisible realities that are basically animating what we perceive with our senses. And, quote, "And this perception," writes Barfield, "which depended on love," remember that, "and a devoted self-surrender, as well as on accurate observation, was a kind of communion for Goethe." So Goethe's way of knowing was love, really assimilating himself to to the object that was to be known, and to have this kind of deep relationship with it, whereby, like, his exact sensorial imagination, the invisible reality that is behind the ever-changing phenomena came to light within his mind. So he felt as though he could perceive these ideas, these invisible realities. So Barfield says in this essay, "If we have managed to hold in our minds the pure idea, or this mental image, of metamorphosis itself, we have, I believe, taken the first step towards perceiving one of Goethe's phenomenon. For metamorphosis, so apprehended, is really the phenomenon, the archetypal phenomenon of the whole of organic nature, of life itself." So this is relevant to Barfield's approach to the evolution of consciousness because, and he's really in a book. It's actually a collection I think they were once talks that he gave, but a book called Speaker's Meaning. He's talking particularly about in the 20th century the emergence of an approach to history, a more theoretical approach to history, which as Barfield has it, is very different from any. I guess there hadn't been that same kind of theoretical approach to history in the past, and he connects this with the idea of metamorphosis because it's this idea, this approach to history which recognizes that there's something that's living on in the present from the past. There's something effective from the past in the present. So I think of Barfield's account of the approach to the evolution of consciousness as a sort of, he's also influenced by Coleridge and others, but almost a kind of Goethean, I should say Rudolf Steiner as well, Goethean approach to history. And it's the inseparability of the human interior or the human subjectivity from the study of history is much more pronounced because Barfield says, unlike in natural science, where we're dealing with natural events, historical events are records that are not just records of natural events, but also natural events as they were experienced by those who recorded them in the language that they've recorded them. So one has to, as I have quoted here, almost reenact the events within one's own imagination, Barfield writes. History itself only comes into being when that which was recorded is brought to life, realized in the mind of the historian. So Barfield acknowledges that in the past, for example, among the Greeks, there was history, but it was a different kind of history. So he says, quote, "Certainly they were interested in persons no longer living and in past events, but only for reasons of family or national prestige, or as paradigms of human nature and human behavior in general." And then Renaissance humanism did indeed possess a historical perspective, but it contrasted antiquity with the present age. Its interest in antiquity as a whole was also paradigmatic. Classical civilization was a model which it not only admired, but was anxious, if possible, to restore. This is quite different from the concern with the past for its own sake, with which a century and a half of historical novels has made us familiar. And then he also says elsewhere in Speaker's Meaning, quote, "There were, of course, older ways of feeling that the past is still effective in the present, ways connected not so much with the free and voluntary activity of thought as with the bloodstream. As, for instance, when the generality of Western mankind or humankind, just insert the more encompassing category, could still feel that they themselves and all men or human beings living in their own time were guilty of the sin committed by their physical ancestor Adam. But this other and newer sense, the sense of a stored past, a past accessible to detailed research, and yet also, and for that reason, alive and effective in the present, is quite different. For here the past is conceived to be alive and effective rather as a memory is alive and effective in the self-consciousness of the present." And so Barfield compares this emergence of this approach to history, which really has to make use of the imaginative capacity of the human inner life, especially because one is doing the philological work of looking at what the words meant during that time, because the meaning of words transforms over time. It necessitates history to distinguish or sort of separate its existence from being encompassed in natural science. So he says it has, quote, too long occupied as a sub-department of science and needs to come into a separate existence as a parallel and autonomous method of cognition, as a valid approach to experience as a whole. Yes, so records, end quote, records, however numerous and exact, are still not themselves history. They're only the raw data. They have to be brought to life. And this is how I would characterize Barfield's approach to the evolution of consciousness. Particularly his is, he looks at the evolution of aesthetic theory in art, but this semantic approach is very crucial for Barfield's method of discerning an evolution of consciousness, or a metamorphosis. So, to further, describe this method, we have to understand more deeply this idea of participation and the transforming nexus of psyche and cosmos. So, Barfield, in Saving the Appearances, he describes, quote, participation is the extrasensory relation between man and the phenomena. He also refers to the phenomena, what we perceive with our senses. Maybe not just, we can't limit phenomena just to that, but he refers to them at any given time in a culture and place as their collective representations, which could sort of similar to like a worldview. It's both like how one is perceiving the external world, which may not be so external depending on the culture, and also how they're understood. So Barfield held that there is this nexus, this extrasensory link that constitutes participation. There's an inward, there's a continuity between my inner life and the inner life of nature or the cosmos. He held that this was changing, that this had changed over time, and he could point to this through his semantic approach to history. And this led him to coin this term logomorphism in poetic diction, which he describes as there's a historical form of it and a psychological form of it, and they could combine. They often do. As he describes them, logomorphism is a delusion. It's very similar to many critics of colonialism, and I'll explain that connection more in a second. But logomorphism, his example of psychological logomorphism is Kant. And to just give a very brief description of Immanuel Kant's philosophy, Kant held that we cannot know the things in themselves. So what we perceive with our senses is not actually the things in themselves, but the way that our human constitution forms them to be for our perception. And that includes time and space for Kant. And so Barfield thought of this as a kind of psychological logomorphism where Kant was generalizing this articulation of human experience for all of humanity, for all time, or at least that's as I understand it. I could be wrong about that with Kant for all time, but I'm not sure. But in general, it's had a very big impact on Western culture. And that's partially related to the way in which the nexus of psyche and cosmos has transformed and how this delusion can be sort of sustained. But Barfield just gives this example, quote, "How many children, I wonder, are nowadays informed at an early age by some elder brother or some guide, philosopher, and friend that what they see and hear and smell is not nature, but the activity of their own nerves. And though that is not Kant's doctrine, it is a crude physiological reflection of it, end quote. So I think this is a perspective that we're probably, most of us are familiar with, even if we're not haven't been into philosophy. So one of the reasons this is significant, actually, before I get to that, let me just mention the historical logomorphism, which is basically the tendency, and this has been very much critiqued in anthropology, for the post-logical mind to project backwards into time the same kind of logical, consciousness, and to try and understand why so-called primitive peoples articulated, or I shouldn't say articulated, rhapsodized the mythologies that they did. And Barfield gives a kind of humorous example of this. So, quote, "The remoter ancestors of Homer, we are given to understand, observing that it was darker in winter than in summer, immediately decided that there must be some cause for this phenomenon, and had no difficulty in tossing off the theory of, say, Demeter and Persephone to account for it. A good name for this kind of banality, the fruit, as it is, of projecting post-logical thoughts back into a pre-logical age, would perhaps be logomorphism." So, so for what's problematic about that is that there's this denial of participation, and and also the assumption is that human consciousness has been the same throughout its whole existence. But that's not the case, according to Barfield. And I think so as well. So, among others, Barfield suggests that such mythologies reflected instead a form of cognition marked by a different relation of subject and object, one not characteristic of logical thinking, or at least not as intensely, polar subject and object. So the said cognition was a kind of picture thinking, much like Goethe's, where there's more of a continuity between the inside of the human experience, the inner life, not the guts, but the immaterial inside, and the external world, the inside of the external world. And I love this description of that kind of participatory experience. The world is more like a garment, including in our physical body as part of that outer garment. And the garment conveys meaning through its qualitative makeup. So its color, its size, how fast things are moving, how they're arranged in space. It's a kind of speaking, and I think this picture, it's called the Flammarion engraving, I think that's how you pronounce it, is a great expression of this person on the ground. To the right, there's more of the kind of regular, world of the senses, but they're sort of breaking through to this perception of the inside of the world, breaking through the garment in a way. So this, I love this quote from Goethe, characterizing his approach to science, which is very much informed by his vocation as a poet as well. "There is a delicate empiricism which makes itself utterly identical with the object." It's kind of love. "Thereby becoming true theory. But this enhancement of our, there's another space there, of our mental powers belongs to a highly evolved age." So, Goethe calls his approach delicate empiricism. And when he says thereby becoming theory, when I was saying earlier that Goethe did not, he allowed, through his delicate empiricism, through his sort of becoming one with the object of observation, there's a kind of almost like subjectivity between them that is, I guess, grown through that kind of loving attention. And the theory arises from the phenomena once they've been attended to in that way. And he says this enhancement of our mental powers belongs to a highly evolved age because it really reflects uh, a, a recognition that that our inner life is not separate from the external world. And there's a moral dimension to that because the the uh, the ultimately the human morality didn't just come from nowhere, didn't just come from humans. There's some kind of moral dimension to the universe itself, and our aspirations for wisdom and knowledge are also require of us a kind of cultivation of virtue. And Barfield, Steiner, among others, thought of Goethe as a kind of exemplar for the possible means of renewing this participatory cognition. And in the next slide, I'm going to present this very short, it's like 46 seconds clip that I feel, and I intended to evoke the mood that Goethe's delicate empiricism, his characterization of it, this little clip, I think, conveys, at least to me, the kind of irreverence that we might consider when approaching trying to know something like the metamorphosis of consciousness, cosmic evolution. So please bracket any aesthetic preferences and just allow the image and the music to work upon you. So I love this clip. It's a digital artwork by this artist Muo, which apparently means to initiate into the mysteries. I just think it's sublime. So I see in it the human being contemplating herself as the instrument for the divine creativity, cosmic creativity, or the divine creativity animating the cosmos to know itself. So one can imagine like the way that the pillars and the designs are moving. It's like this kind of chthonic generativity of the image to be just like welling forth from a kind of infinite, eternal fullness. So Goethe and Barfield held that knowing is a deeply relational and creative activity. So we are not and never have been separate from what we seek to know. So we can call this approach to knowing, or at least it involves love. It may not be love exclusively, but so approaching inward universal history lovingly means beholding the physical cosmos as a kind of messenger of a thou with whom we seek to be united. This is in part why I suggested in the description of this talk that the method could be described, maybe contentiously, as depoliticized or maybe pre-political, so like prior to any articulation of what is beheld, or you could say apolitical to the extent that subsequent articulations reflect their epistemic basis in love through a recognition of this, whatever accounts do arise out of it, being partial and incomplete, especially because what we're talking about is an ongoing process. So, and what I'm going to do next, I'm going to guide those who are viewing the slides through a process that I think would be supportive for understanding Goethe's, the Goethean and Barfieldian approach to phenomena in general. I'm apprenticing to some of the particular manifestations of metamorphosis. So we can think of our human being, our human organism, in and out, as an instrument, and we can tune it by considering some of the features that Goethe delineated of metamorphosis. And one of those includes polarity. Some, people talk a lot about duality, but polarity is this feature in metamorphosis where there's a kind of creative, a generative tension between opposites that are more like contraries that mutually constitute each other, like a magnet. A magnet is a great example. There's a negative and positive end for that magnetic field to be there. So polarity is one feature, and intensification is another. As Gordon L. Miller in his introduction to Goethe's Metamorphosis of Plants writes, quote, "A state of ever-striving ascent," this intensification, "toward greater complexity or perfection, toward the fullest possible expression in physical empirical phenomena of the potential inherent in the underlying idea or phenomenon, so that archetypal invisible reality. Goethe saw evidence of intensification in the metamorphosis of a plant from cruder, simpler, and vegetative stem leaves to finer and more colorful petals and specialized reproductive organs." So if you just kind of imagine, I don't know if cruder is the best word to use, but there is a kind of, even actually these leaves right here are the example, one of the examples. You see there's this development from this kind of, actually, I would say it often things start out more kind of rounded, and then they become more differentiated. And there's a kind of like return. So there's the intensification is part of the process, but there's also a kind of polar return. It's not just all about complexification. There's also a kind of return of simplicity as well. And then this word morphology, which is in the title, it refers to, it refers to the whole field, as Gordon L. Miller writes. Goethe coined this term and founded the fertile field of morphology, science of forms and formative forces aimed at discovering the underlying unity in the vast diversity of plants and animals. So I think of morphology as a kind of like stream. So like this circle of leaves is a morphology, but so is the whole unfolding of a plant form, or even the whole morphology of the human body. Or you could think about history as a morphology, the history of meaning. So I'm going to now show some short clips, and I just want you to allow, just focus on what you're seeing and notice the impression that it makes within you. And this is sort of honing our instrument to better understand the polarity that Barfield sees at work in meaning. So this is an example of expansion. And contraction. And both together. And here with the color, so we had the polarity of expansion and contraction. You could also kind of describe that in color theory. One of these colors seems to be advancing toward you, whereas one may seem to be receding from you. So just notice if you can tell a difference between the way that they affect you inwardly. And then this is an animation of the Rudolf Steiner illustrated these seals, planetary seals. They represent the different planets, and I think it's such a beautiful, as it being animated, it conveys the polarity and intensification really beautifully to me. So it begins with Saturn, Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus. So one way of studying the morphology of consciousness that Barfield exemplifies is by tracing the etymology of words, and he calls this the semantic approach to history. So there is this difference between the records of rocks and the secrets which are hidden in language. Whereas the former can only give us a knowledge of outward dead things, language has preserved for us the inner living history of man's soul. It reveals the evolution of consciousness. And in this semantic approach to history, Barfield has discerned, along with his friend and fellow inkling C.S. Lewis, the polar dynamic of meaning, which he has limnescate between what he calls lexical meaning and speaker's meaning. So, like, lexical meaning is a kind of it's the norm, basically, of a word. It's what we normally mean by a word. Barfield writes, quote, "The actual meaning of a word must be regarded as a kind of habit, the normal habit of contemporary people when they speak or write, and a good dictionary will contain the best way possible for recording or describing that habit. The lexical meaning of a word is a kind of norm," end quote. And so there's a polarity, kind of subset in lexical meaning. The intent is to communicate accurately. So there's some kind of resemblance to mathematics. It can be sort of mechanical and habitual. Whereas speaker's meaning is that more poetic use of language, where the intent, rather than to just communicate as basically and transparently as possible, well, maybe transparent's not the right word to use, but to express oneself like a unique experience or something that is hard to put into words, and the intent there is sincerity. So to sincerely convey something that can't be conveyed because it's so individual or out of the ordinary. And Barfield writes that, I'll just quote, "It is a historical fact that those elusive norms that we call meanings are involved in a constant process of change. It would, moreover, not be very difficult to demonstrate that all mental progress, and arising from that all material progress, is brought about in association with those very changes. One can go further and say that changes are made possible precisely by that there's a discrepancy between an individual speaker's meaning and the current or lexical meaning." One of the examples that Barfield gives in a speaker's meaning, he derives from C.S. Lewis's books, Studies in Words, is the word furniture, which once used to mean something much broader than it typically does for people now. So the phrase could be used, all of the furniture in the universe, or God is not another piece of furniture in the universe, which sounds funny probably to most of us today, because of course God's not a chair in the universe, but that used to mean something more like furniture, more like something in the inventory, whereas C.S. Lewis's example of speakers meaning creating a change is that some individual speakers' more narrow meaning of furniture as domestic, exclusively domestic objects caught fire, and now everybody uses furniture to mean that more narrow meaning. So this is an example for Barfield of the way in which speakers' meaning can contract meaning from a broader meaning to a more narrow one. But it can also expand it. And one example of the expansion of meaning that Barfield gives in Speaker's Meaning, the book, is Newton's use of the word gravity, which before Newton just generally applied to, it was more narrowly circumscribed to objects, to anything that was below the moon. Because before Newton, there was science, the approach to science was permeated by Aristotelian philosophy, which thought of everything from the moon below to the earth as being very different from everything else in the cosmos. And that the force of, so gravity just meant basically the weight or heaviness of something that made it fall to the center, to the earth. And they couldn't think about it. They had difficulty thinking about gravity as something that could be applied to anything beyond the moon, because they thought the outer space was completely different. The physics of the Earth did not apply to the space beyond the moon. But thanks to Newton, now when we think of gravity, we think of this force, this abstract force that has to do with the relations of things here on Earth, but also all throughout outer space, apparently. So that's just an example of the way in which speaker's meaning one example of the way in which speaker's meaning can expand the meaning of a word. So in the overall morphology of consciousness, also just to keep in mind that Barfield, as I understand it, his semantic approach to history is focused on the Indo-European languages, but through his study of the metamorphosis of semantics, he's discerned what he describes as an overall contraction in the morphology of consciousness, a contraction. Quote, "The evolution of consciousness has mainly taken the form of a contraction of meaning and therefore of consciousness, an evolution from wide and vague to narrow and precise, and from what was peripherally based to what is centrally based." And this is important for our considerations of the polar dynamic of meaning, because for Barfield, speaker's meaning doesn't come in until at least in a kind of expansive way, it doesn't come in until there's been this contraction, where before lexical meaning, all meaning, language was for Barfield given until recently. So I'll describe that more as I go. So here's another quote from Barfield. He's describing this is another way of describing the morphology, how the morphology of consciousness looks to him as he's traced the semantics. So, quote, "The balance in figuration, which would describe as the unconscious activity which structures our perception of inside and outside, we're not necessarily in charge of it, between what is given to us from without, what we perceive from without, external world, and what we contribute from within, has changed radically over the course of history. From earliest man, humankind, nearly all the activity of figuration came from without, as I was just describing, the lexical meaning, which is another way of saying that the inside of things was experienced more out there than in here, which also implies that out there was not quite so out there as it has become for us. The perceiver was directly aware of this of the beings, Barfield says, constituting this inside. So if you think about this in connection with gods and goddesses, or spirit beings, or what is called animism, which is I'll explain later, is based on logomorphism, the way that at least the early anthropologists understood or defined animism. So the perceiver was once directly aware of the beings constituting this inside, an awareness we badly misinterpret if we take it as an erroneous theorizing about things today. Today, on the other hand, we contribute to the inside of things, like Goethe. We participate in them from within ourselves, and we are largely unaware of the contribution. Our primary conscious mode of thinking is a thinking about things. In Speaker's Meaning, towards the end of the book, Barfield illustrates this metamorphosis of this relation, this transforming nexus connected with participation, transforming nexus of psyche and cosmos, going from the 17th century to the late 19th century, and conveying the changes in the definition of the word subject. So like, I'm a subject. So here we go. So in the 17th century, the definition was pertaining to the essence or reality of a thing. It meant real, essential. In the first half of the 18th century, subjective or subject meant having its source in the mind. In the second half of the 18th century, we have pertaining to peculiar to an individual subject or his or her mental operations, personal, individual. So far, we have the connotations of reality plus a steadily increasing emphasis on the activity of the individual. Reserved for the second half of the 19th century, it is reserved for the second half of the 19th century to go to the length of actually reversing the meaning in one respect, so that the adjective, whose lexical meaning was real, essential, becomes an adjective whose lexical meaning is existing only in the mind. It's just subjective. And that's the predominant lexical meaning today. Subjective is not usually used in a very good way if we're talking, in the kind of common sense discussion around truth or something like that. And so Barfield says that one of the reasons why this this subjective was described this way was because in the 19th century milieu of materialism, the way people were thinking, at least in Europe and the United States at the time, was that material objects, the external world, precedes the mind, precedes consciousness. It's before consciousness. So those are more real than the subject, the inner life of the subject. But Barfield says, but there's not the recognition that the concept of an object without a subject is just totally abstract. It doesn't actually make sense. And so for Barfield, in his semantic discernment of this semantic morphology, he discerns this transition from there was once meaning was given, language was given during this time when the nexus between psyche and cosmos was more active on the cosmos side or the object side. So almost he describes this in relation, as I'll get to in a moment, artistic psychology, where there was once the idea that the artist was possessed by a spirit, and that's what animated the artistic creation or activity. So there's been this transition from the activity being almost sort of outside, but not quite outside, as I was describing earlier, to now, at least in many parts of the world, not everywhere, we might say, more activity on the side of the subject, and less activity, seemingly, on the side of the object. The world is no longer speaking to us, or at least many of us. So in this development, Barfield has discerned an increased there's a polarization of words, word meaning. So there are now words that are related exclusively to the inner world, like our feelings. Like in a second, I'll show talk about the heart, but not completely. And outer meanings. So things, this kind of literalization of meanings. So like the moon, for example, is just an outer object. There's nothing inside me or that could correspond to the moon. And he describes this as the word meanings losing their translucency, and because there was not the same experience of the subject object, like this radical distinction, where actually the object has more reality than the subject. In contrast, when meaning was given, almost as if like wisdom was mediated through the cosmos, and language was just sort of given to human beings, and because of that, there was like this resemblance, or this translucency, where through like my physical heart was just the outward image of a kind of inner heart. So this is one of the words that Barfield thinks is still conveys that composite or translucent meaning. So he says, the plain truth is that we use the word heart as we do, not because we are poets, but because the word still has a history. It is that all language has been, and some still is, imagery, in the sense that one meaning is apprehended transpiring through another. We look back and we find concatenate meanings, or uncontracted meanings, that have since become and are for us now separable and concatenate. We find an inner meaning transpiring, or in some way through the outer. So for Barfield, he calls this figurative language, and that all language was once figurative, but it's polarized into literal meanings that apply to inner and outer. So he says, non-figurative language, quote, on the other hand, is a late arrival. What we call literal meanings, whether inner or outer, are never samples of meaning in its infancy. They are always meanings in their old age, end products of a historical process. So if you think about meaning and metamorphosis, there's this kind of living process that has happened, but also there's like husks. And so these words, literal words, are kind of like husks that need to be re-enlivened through poetry. But that only really happens once there's no longer the meaning being given. So I think I'm showing this image again because I think it conveys the way in which the phenomenal world, or the world of appearances, the world that we perceive with our senses, was in the time when meaning was translucent. So was the world. The world was a kind of script that could be read. And Goethe, again, is an example of one who has taken the time to let the world speak within. So rather than being spoken to kind of like from without, it's coming from within, because the emphasis has shifted. And so as I mentioned in the description, or I just raised this question, is there a distinction between a history of consciousness and the history of ideas? And for Barfield, there is, and but it doesn't make sense unless it's contextualized in the whole morphology of the evolution of consciousness. And there is a legitimate history of ideas. So, quote, "It is to me rather too flattering a view to take of the philosophers, not accepting even Aristotle, to regard them as the efficient and sufficient causes of collective representations, or the worldviews, shared by the greater part of Western humanity for nearly 20 centuries." So if you think about it, that is kind of, people could just say no if it were that simple. From the point of view of the history of consciousness, their writings are rather landmarks to indicate the nature of that consciousness, inasmuch as they represent the human mind in its most wakeful state. And he goes on to say, at the same time, owing to the subtle link between thinking and figuration, so the way in which our words and our thinking with words gradually does start to impact the way that we perceive the world, and to the part played by language in evoking and sustaining the collective representations, they are by no means without causal significance. So Barfield says this in Saving the Appearances. So he's admitting that there is, in the articulation of philosophies, there is a causal significance, but it really, for Barfield, doesn't take on causal significance until this process of meaning being given has ceased, and we've received all of the lexical meaning, but there's a kind of silence from the world, and a necessity to, through speaker's meaning, through kind of a poetic use of metaphor, re-enliven our experience of the world. And that's really when philosophy begins to take on more of a causal significance. But again, it's sort of qualified. So Barfield acknowledges that there's a legitimate history of ideas, so one which grows in causal significance in accordance with the loss of participation is another way to characterize it, and the need for its renewal, which may be achieved by individual thinkers when they expand meaning through the use of metaphor to enrich the collective representations or worldview of their culture, enlarging the scope of what can be perceived, as Newton did with his extension of gravity, and Goethe with his use of this earth phenomenon. But for Barfield, the causal significance of any philosophical articulations for the evolution of consciousness is always indexed to the morphological trend already underway. And this is sort of similar to J.R.R. Tolkien's idea of subcreation, or as many people say today, co-creation, that captures the idea as well, which suggests that one can either serve something, this kind of deeper telos that's unfolding, by making it more lucid for our contemporaries and posterity, or one can potentially obscure it by refusing to acknowledge what wants to unfold. But there's some kind of participation. And getting toward the end here, as I mentioned before, one of the other ways that Barfield is pointing out that there's been an actual shift in emphasis from the kind of activity of the cosmic wisdom being mediated to us to the subject. This is evident for him, especially in the transformation of aesthetic theory from Plato up until today. So I'd say here, from inspired mania to imaginative porosity, this metamorphosis of artistic inspiration into imagination. So as I mentioned before, Plato and others thought that what was at work in the poetic, in the poet, was genius, but for them genius meant like an actual spirit that possessed the poet, and but also, so Barfield distinguishes between the aesthetic theory around method and psychological experience. So the psychological experience, according to Plato and others, was that the artist was being possessed by something that was not them, whether it was a god, a muse, the genius. But gradually, genius, as many of us, will know, has taken on a meaning that its meaning now is as if it's a possession of the artist. The artist is a genius rather than the genius has the artist. And then the method, Plato in the Republic thought that poets were potentially dangerous, or this is maybe not necessarily Plato's perspective, but in the Republic, when they're imagining the ideal society, they're a little wary of the poets because they think, or at least it is thought in the Republic, that poets merely reproduce or imitate nature, and nature in the Republic is thought to be just an imperfect imitation of a divine reality. So artists are really just imitators, or they're just producing copies of copies. Whereas now the artist is associated with creativity, of bringing something new in. And that's connected with this gradual transformation of the aesthetic theory around the method, where the artist, instead of copying external nature, the artist is somehow participating in the invisible archetypal creativity that is behind the what we observe in the creativity of nature, to create something completely new. And so Barfield discerns in this that there's another example of a way in which it was there was once this experience of the subject being more passive and subject to something outside of itself, to the artist being described as one who possesses the genius, but especially this is very prominent in modern art. There's the aspiration to align oneself with something that's super individual. So Barfield describes perhaps I just love this. Quote, "This is a case where the change in theory cannot have been merely a dialectical progress." So it's not just the causality of different ideas working on each other, merely a growing of accuracy in the observation of the same data, but that it must reflect a change in the data themselves. Then we must say that what we have before us when we look at artistic or poetic activity historically is an actual transition from one kind of event to another. And end quote. Now one more quote. "Perhaps all our endeavors to say something fruitful about imagination can best be seen as a struggle to reject the old concept of inspired mania, inspiration, and yet somehow retain it." This is connected with the deeper telos and subcreation. Somehow retain it, to reject the old super individual psychology, and at the same time to develop an individual psychology which is viable for the phenomenon of art. It is felt, or it was until very recently, that both a super individual and an individual view of the provenance of art are necessary and must somehow be combined, although they appear to be mutually exclusive. We get, in fact, a kind of polarity of contraries, which is closely analogous to the polarity between communication and expression, or speaker's meaning, that I have suggested underlies the nature of language. So again, this is another way that Barfield, apart from it does involve the semantic approach to history, but he's looking specifically at semantics in relation to the transformation in aesthetic theory, which corroborates further this morphological trend toward contraction, toward the individual. Yes. And this GIF here is of Maya Deren, who's one of my greatest inspirations, an experimental filmmaker of the 20th century, whose quote there, I think, illustrates Barfield's point about the transition from inspiration to imagination. But also, if you don't know anything about her, Maya Deren was very, very much interested in trying to attain to this merger of the individual and the super individual. She went to Haiti and spent a lot of time with voodoo practitioners there. And this is my final slide. So thank you for being with me through all of this so far. And I just want to speak a bit more to this suggestion or this question of colonialism and the evolution of consciousness. So just want to emphasize that the method itself is aspirational. I think, as I was emphasizing earlier, reading Goethe's quote, that there's a moral dimension in this in the aspiration to know, and that's important to emphasize. This striving to intuitively unite, inwardly unite with the phenomena that we perceive in the outer world. I think there's a kind of empathy that is necessary for one who endeavors to pursue, for example, the semantic approach to history, an empathy, that you need in order to imagine yourself into the historical personages and what things meant for them, if we're to do them justice. And also just to mention that, this is a, Barfield, again, was focused on the Indo-European languages, so it's a partial view, and I'd be really interested to see how it would, if there's any kind of similar trend in languages around the world, or different trends, so the trend toward contraction, and if those could somehow be related to each other, that would be a really interesting project. And so also, colonial articulations could arise out of this approach to discerning the evolution of consciousness, but I think they would ultimately be antithetical to the moral basis of it. And it's recognized by Barfield and others kindred to him that it's a living, evolving knowledge. So it's not like this is where we stop in the contraction. Yes, so this aspiration towards more of a planetary, intercultural translation, I think, is really exciting. And I'm going to end with this quote from Barfield's narrative, autobiographical narrative, An Ancestral Voice, where he has the voice of wisdom speaking within him about this sort of phase of this moment in the evolution of consciousness, where there's been this kind of contraction but the potential to go back out. Quote, the voice of wisdom says, if you would faithfully trace the course taken by the mind of man since it first began to apprehend regularity in nature, then you must distinguish in the domain of nature herself between the earth and the universe beyond it. It was in the universe beyond, among the stars and planets, that regularity and irregularity were first distinguished. It was not until men had transferred the habit of that discernment from the heavens to the earth that they beheld upon the earth, too, any laws of nature. And this they could do because it is out of that universe that the body of the earth has shrunk together. It has shrunk together and gathered into itself the life of the universe, as the seed shrinks together with the parent plant. All its exterior irregularities point back to that origin. But the earth is not a lifeless relic. It is also the living body of mankind. And permeating the old machine, there is the new life that looks forward to the future. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashton.
Thank you.
And I encourage everybody to use whatever emoji you'd love to, or you'd like to share your thoughts here. I'm going to invite everybody to just take a moment and think about what you heard. And when you are ready for any questions, go ahead and either raise your hand or bring yourself off mute. And maybe, Ashton, you can call on anybody you see asking questions.
Trying to get back. Oh, here we go. Stop share. Cool.
One of the things that your presentation brought up for me is just imagination as a skill, almost a function, a art form, a method, all of these sort of ways to sort of reimagine different relationships. So I appreciated how you started with just sort of trying to imagine a route to diplomacy and peace, and you know um, and really sort of thinking about that might already be here, you know, if we're able to imagine it. And so I wonder how reimagining things in your own life have been beneficial or hard, or if you're running into resistance on that, or if you find it's a great way to sort of re-enchant your life and all of that. So I'm curious how it works out for you personally.
Um, so could you say a little more? I'm not sure how to answer.
Well, just the focus, I think, on imagination and participation offers a new relationship, I think, to oneself and one's environment, because there's a sort of the curtain is thrown off, right? And so now you're able to perceive, and there's a sort of illumination maybe, or an enchantment. And so I imagine that can be really difficult on the one hand, especially if you're with people who are not sort of able to imagine the same way you are. And it might be productive, but it also might be um, new. And so I'm wondering kind of, um, what you mentioned is very such great theory and such great examples from in a historical kind of way. And I'm wondering, yeah, I guess where you're able to really, if you're noticing kind of places where this ability to sort of reimagine things in ways that you know uh, bring out that kind of inner, uh, the driving mystery behind the phenomenal experience that you're now able to sort of see. Um, I don't know.
Well, I guess I could say that I I guess I have more of um, a sense of the invisible. I mean, that's one thing I could say. Um, and particularly, I think in like just paying attention more to plants and also um, the the just how uh, the cycle of the moon is its own kind of metamorphosis, over the months, and the yeah, I guess I have increasingly felt more like I can hear the world speaking, and not just abstractly, like actually watching the planets in the sky move, and whereas I mean, I think the astrology is a great example of recognizing the um, polarity, and just this kind of symphonic mm, metamorphosis of and the focus. I don't know. Rick will often kind of suggest that there's something maybe about Earth that's very special, and maybe the dance of the planets around us. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer your question, but
Just wondering what you're imagining, and what's alive for you. So that's a great share. Thank you,
thanks for the question. Appreciate it.
Robert. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Good work, Ashton. I've been looking forward to this, and I'm wondering where you're going. What are you doing? And for a long time, I thought of you as doing something about movement, and then I heard you were studying Barfield, and I was saying, well, I wonder how that's going to work. I thought, oh, well, Barfield started out as a ballroom dancer, so maybe you're traveling his journey from dancing to epistemology to history of words or whatever. So I guess my question is to sort of draw you out a little bit about your own journey. So when you're reading Barfield, as you've obviously done quite a bit, you have to be a little conscious of Goethe, and then maybe Coleridge, and then Steiner, and then, of course, then you're focused on Barfield. So my question is, where is Barfield taking you? What's the payoff, to speak pragmatic terms? What is his distinctive contribution that you want to foster and advance in your life and in your career? What is it that you're standing on or carrying or pushing that is distinctively Barfield's?
Well, I think it really it sort of comes back to what I mentioned at the beginning, which is I think Barfield and Steiner also they they've really helped me to think about pluralism in a more satisfactory way than I have encountered it in other thinkers, and and so you may not know this about me, but I've been really deeply into astrology since I was in high school, and have lived with it for a long time. And I don't think I had, apart from Rick's Cosmos and Psyche, encountered philosophical articulations that really helped me to, I don't know, I guess, I don't know, yeah, can have a continuity between the Earth and the rest of the cosmos. And so I think that's one of the things that Barfield and also Steiner really have helped me to deepen into, and something that I would like to carry forth. But I guess Barfield also helps me to think about the future, in a way that helps me to, I don't know, have a sense of like what I can do, or how I can also think about things in a way that is participatory, and not just abstract. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll be watching and listening.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you so much, Ashton. That was a very rich discussion. I really look forward to watching it again, actually. And I apologize for the glitch. I'm not sure what happened with the phone.
Good. I didn't notice. It's fine.
Somehow my phone interrupted, but yeah, I'm really glad you bring up the astrological, because I've been thinking about astrology and the birth chart recently, just this year, in a really specific way, relative to it being an instantiation of the Logos and Sophia, and that we are in a participatory relationship with the archetypes. Like we can't, like Hillman says, we're within, you can't be but within the gods and goddesses. And it seems as though Barfield and Steiner are both pointing towards the type of imaginative engagement with them so that the wisdom in them can unfold, and the wisdom that's in us as well in a participatory relationship, and that it requires that type of Cartesian attention and awareness to allow for the deeper wisdom to be realized. And I have a specific question really about logomorphism, and I've only read Saving the Appearances. And I was wondering, you were saying logomorphism was deficient, or I'm not sure if it was somehow, I'm not sure what the word was, but I was thinking, is that related to Barfield's understanding of idolatry? And then you also mentioned logomorphism in connection with animism. And so I was curious if you could unpack that a little more. Or...
Sure, yeah. Well, he writes about that at least in Poetic Diction, maybe elsewhere too. But so the connection with the anthropological category of animism is that so logomorphism for Barfield, is premised on the refusal to think that there's a changing nexus between cosmos and psyche, or that participation. So and there's like materialists, at least among the the people, not Kant maybe, but the other thinkers he was characterizing as logomorphic materialist presuppositions. So the subject is like a later thing, the human interiority, and so the early anthropologists would describe animism as the mistaken projection of human fantasies of gods and goddesses onto the external world. So that's a kind of an error of the anthropologist that's rooted in logomorphism. And then what was the other question?
That was it. And it was logomorphism related to idolatry.
Oh, yeah, I would say so. I mean, at least I feel like you could probably, there could be variants of logomorphism, but definitely the materialist flavor of it would, be connected with idolatry, because they think the only thing that's really real are the surfaces, or the outsides.
Right.
That there's no inside to nature or human consciousness.
Thank you. It was incredibly rich. I really look forward to viewing it again.
Thank you, Chad. I appreciate that. I see Layla. Hi, Layla.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, thank you so much, Ashton. That was incredibly engaging, and I don't have a lot to say. I just want to know, can I read the transcript or see your presentation somewhere? And I really thought that the use of images and animations was evocative, and I loved the idea of hearing philosophy while watching images to help illustrate. So thank you for that.
Awesome. Thanks. I appreciate that. Those kind words. I think Matt. Yeah, this is recorded, so it'll be probably on YouTube at some point. And I'll definitely be writing some kind of. This is basically my proposal. So I can send you that once I'm done writing it, if you like. Thank you.
Matt, go ahead.
Thanks, Matt. Hey, Ashton. I'm going to leave my video off because I'm in a dark room over here. Can you guys hear me okay, though?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So, Ash, first of all, thanks for the sort of tour of some of Barfield and Goethe's deeper insights into language and the evolution of consciousness. I really feel like I understand them more deeply now. And a question for you is about how, or if you think this account of the morphology of consciousness tells us anything about the future. If in some ways the shapes that consciousness has moved through in the past reveals anything about the shapes that we are destined to move through in the future, and if so, how do you sit with that? Because Barfield, Goethe, and Steiner, particularly Steiner, right? Steiner did think that he could see, in some sense, the shape that the future of consciousness was going to take. I'm just wondering how you relate to using this methodology, not just to understand the past, but to understand the future.
Thank you for your question. Well, I think, in relation to Steiner, I think there's, some, I would describe, if I were trying to describe the way Steiner talks about, his sort of like tracing of the contours of the future to someone, I would talk about like, if you stood in a river the same place every day, or maybe that's not the greatest example, but if you're just like very attuned to the movement of the river, you may have a sense for how the river is moving up ahead, and because there's this polarity, this rhythmic character to morphology, that's exemplified. The polarity is I guess, polarity. There's some maybe way of kind of just like you can sort of sense when this beat of the song will change, and you can move your body in a way that is in sync with it. That's sort of like a way of thinking about those pronouncements about the future that Steiner made. But also, he and others talk about like radical emergences, and it's especially now that we embrace this idea that there's more of a, I guess, efficacy among human subjects, that things could go in directions that are totally novel. But I guess, how do I relate to that? I don't know. I think I just sort of remain open-minded, and I really think that it's hard for me to make up my mind about anything like that without having more of a sense of like like I was describing toward the end of the talk. What if we look at other semantic histories in other parts of the world? It's like I would like to have more of a sense of that before I have any kind of confident feelings about what's coming in the future. Yeah, I think there is, the most I could say maybe is just, in connection with Barfield's, he calls final participation, or just embracing this directionally creator role, and for our futures, and living and perceiving in ways that are, as best we can, I guess, indexed to what we would like the world to be like. I'll stop there. Thanks for your question. What do you think, Matt? Do you have anything to say in relation to that?
Oh, well, I liked your answer. Were you asking Matt Switzer?
I was asking you since you asked the question,
okay.
but I'd love to hear what Matt Switzer has to say too.
So would I. I mean, it seems like Barfield, following Steiner, thought that our particular moment in the evolution of consciousness was about realizing freedom to some extent, and like the contraction of participation was that we weren't given meaning by the cosmos. We had to, in some way, realize or express it for ourselves freely out of love, right? And if freedom is what it's all about for us in this moment, then the future, we can't exactly think of the future as determined, right? Because we have to freely achieve it in some sense. And so
Yeah.
I always have had this conflict in my own understanding, at least, between the realization of freedom in our historical moment and the Steinerian view of a future that was more or less prefigured, at least in outline. Right. So yeah, I just struggle with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ashton, do you think if this emergence of the consciousness level coming into this, I feel like merging into this present form of being, like in the indigenous tribes, they always talk about being present and aware of the moment. Like you were talking about Goethe and his relationship with the plant people and really invoking that wisdom and understanding of those beings. So if as a collective group, as we achieve into this next transcendent level, which Steiner talks about, especially in the Higher Worlds book, he always talks about these like levels of transcendence and moving into this other realm. I don't think we're supposed to possibly know the future per se, but to feel like as Matt was saying, that freedom feeling, we have to have that, be open and free and kind of be able to let go and molt out that which doesn't serve us anymore. But being in the present, if we're core in the present, we could possibly be able to wake up enough beings in the conscious level that to move forward for a potential more enlightened, more happy, more love bearing future through that maybe conscious, that shift. Does that make sense? I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah.
But that shift forward, I mean, do you think that could be like kind of possible, like in with that?
You mean what possible in particular, or
Just this, like being the present moment, and in that present moment, waking up that conscious level of the love, the transcendence to go forward, and then that, into the future kind of thoughts.
yeah.
I know for the people, they always say that it takes 7 generations of grandmothers and grandfathers for the next generation to come forward. They dream forward the children for the future. So I wonder if that has a kind of play into, kind of what Barfield's trying to talk about. And I do feel it fits with Steiner in his, especially like later on when he talks more about the transcendence and moving forward.
So just like you're describing, just like the presence sort of makes space for the more ideal to.
Yeah, so being more present, of course, you're going to be more open, you're going to be more aware, and then
Yeah.
seeing the surroundings. Like
Right.
as in Goethe talked about, I wish more, especially in the scientific realm, that more of that to be open, because I think scientists don't understand that they have more relationship with things than they are aware of. They just aren't aware of yet. Does that make sense? Like it just needs to that open up, that kind of sense.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that Barfield writes about in the Speaker's Meaning book is how like sort of he calls it a taboo towards the end that people don't tend to infringe because the meanings of the words that we've been conditioned into have latent within them like presupposition that matter is prior to mind or consciousness, and so anyway, I was just thinking of that in connection with what you were talking about, like the generations of the future and sort of like I was also thinking about our class, Robert Bella, and Religion and Human Evolution, and that his discussion of the relaxed field and how that's necessary for kind of new potentials to be received, maybe, whereas many people are driven by necessity to just always in survival mode or not really able to be in the present. So that does seem very important. Yeah. I hope that. hope I.
No, thank you. I thought it was great. It was great. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks. Thanks for being here.
We've got a little bit of time for any last questions. I'm going to give a last warning for all of those who need a little push to ask them. I also know we have another Arnoldy on the so always a fun opportunity to
Which one is it?
ask your family members some questions.
Oh, I think they're. Oh, I guess I can only see the people who are on camera. So let's see. Sarah, yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that. Sarah wasn't trying to suggest that people should not be in survival mode, just that the conditions of the world and economic don't make it easy for most people not to be.
I'm curious, Matt or Robert, what you were saying, Matt, about Steiner's understanding of freedom. Is that like an absolute freedom that like we're disconnected in some absolute or fundamental way from nature or reality or the evolution of time or something? Because I can understand it in the sense of like how there was more participatory relationship from the beginning, like we were God, the meaning was given to us, and then there's been this differentiation, now this autonomy and freedom to choose to make the future happen. But is that freedom conceptualized as complete, like absolute, like we're not embedded, not participating anymore until we choose to participate? Yeah. For Ashton.
Robert, I'm curious to hear what you're saying, but you're muted.
I was saying you set up the evolution of consciousness so well that it almost answers Chad's question, but I could add to it if you want.
Please.
Yes.
Yes, go for it, Robert. Let's hear it, Robert. Yeah, or no, go ahead, Matt.
Well, while Robert's thinking, I was just going to say, Chad, I don't think that what I intended to convey when I spoke to Steiner's sense of freedom, it's not freedom from nature in the way that, say, a typical like libertarian would think in the modern period of their freedom to control and manipulate nature or something. I think the way I was trying to convey the sense of freedom coming out of Steiner and Barfield's work is rather the opposite, like the freedom to reunite with nature, to recognize it as in some sense part of our garment. Like Ashton was talking about how the visible cosmos, just as much as our visible bodies, are sort of the garment worn by this interior, by interiority, by mind, by consciousness, and the consciousness that's evolving, and that the freedom that we need to realize, the task for our age, as Steiner seems to have understood it, was to freely reunite using this kind of Goethean epistemology, or gentle empiricism, loving empiricism, that, like Ashton was describing it, to reunite with nature, to recognize it as in some sense part of ourselves, and that recognition would be a free deed. It wouldn't be something that would be done for us, and that in original for those people who were still in the period of original participation, it was in a sense it was done for them. But the freedom we realize in our age is the freedom to reunite out of an act of our own will. Does that make sense, Chad?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What do you think, Ash?
I was a little distracted by the chat. Yeah. I want to hear from other people. I've talked a lot.
Sarah, do you want to share?
Yeah, sorry, I was waiting. Well, to kind of reflect off of what Matt was just speaking on freedom and on will, and how much we were participating at one point in consciousness versus now, what is being done for us. I mean, it gets tricky because I just keep considering the various expressions of kind of like an automated state of consciousness, where we're kind of not fully conscious, we're more asleep or tuned in, or there's so many different ways you can look at it, either in a very divine and beautiful light, whether connected to the earth or to the heavens. You can also see it in a kind of industrialized, technological, enslaved sense. And I guess I have to just question then, you know, with all these various degrees of what can be an automation of consciousness, how much we're actually in control or not in control. It's just like, it's very gray. I don't know, that's just what was coming from what Matt was saying in regards to, we had it kind of something done for us. And I just have to question that, because it seems like it could really be either way.
That's a good point. I think maybe there's just maybe you could say that there's a potential now. There's this anthroposophist named Lisa Romero who writes and talks sometimes about technology and inner work, and she sort of describes that there's like this kind of tension that's provided by automation and this sort of increased, encroachment of the technologies that we're developing on our inner lives, and she describes it as a kind of potential foil for increased interactivity. So there's a potential, I guess you could say, for increased interactivity, but there's also the potential for a different kind of passivity. Yeah. So I would, thinking with Barfield, characterize the way that he was talking about the former kind of like language and meaning sort of being given. I feel like what he's describing is a different dynamic at that time, and a different form of subjectivity from what there is now, and I guess a different kind of also, as far as technology is concerned, a different kind of activity from without, that is, I guess, making demands on our subjectivity. Just some thoughts.
Yeah, I guess just the main thing I was trying to challenge, and it wasn't even what you had said, but what Matt had said about, the certain stage where we were either less, I don't think we were less participatory. I think we just were in a very unique and different way. And how much will or volition there was. It's just, that's all. It just seems like it's tricky to know for sure.
Yeah, definitely tricky.
Robert, I think last we left you, you were thinking about some answers with regards to some of the questions. Did you have anything you wanted to share, Robert, or?
Well, I suppose I could say something about freedom, since it follows so directly from Ashton's really fine talk. That freedom isn't something that we can say is or isn't. It's he says it's the Steiner and Barfield both consider it the goal of the evolution of consciousness, freedom and love. And love is impossible without freedom, and love is the highest expression of freedom. And so when we think about participation, Steiner and Barfield think that we should participate in order to create love in every phase, every aspect, every dimension of earthly life. And it's the only place where it can be done, according to them. So all that Ashton said about participation becomes tremendously crucial with respect to freedom. It's participation is possible, well, makes love possible, makes freedom possible. And without participation, they can't happen. And with participation, they can create the self-fulfilling. The more that there's participation, the more love and freedom. The more love and freedom, the more participation. But it's a process which is at risk every minute. It's a little bit like what Ben Franklin said about the new democratic government. It'd be really great if they can keep it. And freedom is really great if they can realize it. And I just read the Steiner's introduction to the Gospel of St. John, and he says 4 times that this is the future of humanity. And then he says, if humanity can realize its task, and its task is freedom and love. Follows directly from what, I mean, Ashton, you really laid the groundwork for the next step, which is to say, what's this all about? It's all about freedom and love. So yeah, so good going, Ashton. I hope you stay at it. You're in good material.
Thank you. That means a lot. Appreciate that, Robert.
All right. Well, on that note, with freedom and love in our hearts, I'm gonna invite you to stick around and talk with one another if you'd like. But we're gonna bring this forum to a close. Feel free to find us on Facebook, on the internet, whatever. And we'll have this video up for all of you shortly. So thank you so much, Ashton, and thank you so much, everybody, for being here and sharing time with us.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Ashton. Well done.